February 17, 1944. 4:47 a.m. A Japanese radar operator at Truk Lagoon stares at a screen that shows nothing. Absolute silence. The most powerful naval fortress in the Pacific is asleep. 5 airfields, 300 aircraft, 50 warships, 7,500 soldiers. All of them breathing slowly in the dark, convinced they are untouchable. They have 11 minutes left to believe that, at 4:58 a.m. 72. American Hellcat fighters drop out of the pre-dawn sky at 300 miles per hour, and the first Japanese Zero explodes on the runway before its pilot can reach the cockpit. Then another. Then 6 more in the same minute. Men are running in every direction and dying before they understand what is running toward them. The fuel dumps catch fire, and the light from the burning aircraft turns the lagoon orange, and the soldiers who scramble out of their barracks see the sky full of American planes, and nothing in the air to stop them. In 48 hours, Japan will lose 50 ships, 250 aircraft, 4,500 men, and 17,000 tons of fuel oil that will burn for 2 days straight. The fortress that took 5 years to build will be gone. The man most responsible for this catastrophe is not the American admiral who ordered the attack. He is a Japanese vice admiral who made a single decision 2 weeks earlier, a decision so ordinary that no one recorded the exact moment he made it a decision to let exhausted pilots sleep. That decision ended the war in the Pacific 18 months early. To understand what burned at Truk on February 17, 1944, you need to understand what Truk actually was, not the legend, but the specific physical reality of what Japan had built inside that reef over 5 years, and what it meant to keep an empire running across 10 million square miles of ocean. The lagoon itself was geology doing Japan a favor. A drowned volcanic caldera 40 miles across, enclosed by a coral barrier reef that rose from the ocean floor and created a natural harbor large enough to shelter an entire fleet. The Japanese had recognized it before the war and had been building inside it since 1939, adding facilities the way you add rooms to a house when the family keeps growing and the war keeps spreading. By February 1944, Truk had 5 operational airfields capable of handling 300 to 400 aircraft simultaneously. It had a seaplane base. It had repair facilities that could handle fleet-level maintenance, meaning they could take a cruiser that had been shot up in the Solomons and put it back together well enough to fight again. It had fuel storage holding tens of thousands of tons of refined petroleum. It had ammunition dumps, port infrastructure, the entire logistical skeleton of a navy fighting a war at continental scale. Every major Japanese operation in the Central and South Pacific for 2 years had been supported from Truk. Every ship that sortied toward Guadalcanal, toward the Solomons, toward the Gilberts, had been fueled from this lagoon. The convoys that carried oil from the captured fields in Borneo and the Dutch East Indies northward to the Japanese home islands assembled here and dispersed here under the protection of land-based air cover. American submarines had been hunting Japanese tankers since 1942 with steadily improving effectiveness, and Truk was the one place in the Central Pacific where those tankers could shelter and resupply and continue their work under the umbrella of 300 aircraft and 40 major anti-aircraft guns. The coral reef that surrounded it was 30 miles across. Naval gunfire from outside could never penetrate it. The mountains of the central island rose high enough to make low-level bombing approaches from certain directions nearly impossible. American planners had looked at Truk for 2 years and concluded that a direct amphibious assault would cost more than it was worth, possibly more than the United States was willing to pay. Then the shipyards finished their work. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 in February 1944 was something the Pacific War had not yet seen. 9 fleet and light carriers, 6 new fast battleships, 10 cruisers, more than 20 destroyers, 540 aircraft capable of being put in the air simultaneously by a fleet that could sustain high-speed operations over thousands of miles without stopping. The American industrial machine had been running at full capacity for 2 years, and this was what 2 years of full capacity produced. A carrier task force that could project strike power against any target within range of its aircraft, which, in February 1944, meant any target in the Central Pacific. Mitcher had been preparing his pilots through operations against the Marshall Islands, the outer ring of the Japanese defensive perimeter that the Americans were dismantling one atoll at a time. His air groups had been learning the specific discipline of carrier aviation in combat, the fighter sweeps, and the coordinated strikes, and the torpedo approaches, and the dive bombing runs that had to be executed in proper sequence against a defended target to work. They had been learning on targets that were difficult but survivable. Truk was the final exam. The Japanese at Truk knew something was coming. Marine Corps reconnaissance aircraft PB-4Y. Liberators had overflown the lagoon in the first days of February, and Japanese observers had reported them. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, the commander of Japan's Fourth Fleet, knew American eyes had been on his base. What he did not know was that American carrier aviation had grown to the point where it could attack Truk directly without the preliminary land-based air campaign that conventional military logic said would be necessary to wear down the defenses first. Kobayashi's pilots had been on high alert for weeks. The air crews of the 22nd and 26th Air Flotillas had been sleeping in their flight gear, running to their aircraft at every alarm, sitting in ready rooms, waiting for the attack that kept not arriving. Alert fatigue is a specific medical reality with specific physiological consequences. Pilots, who are kept in sustained high alert states for weeks without the attack materializing, do not perform at full effectiveness when the attack finally comes. Their reaction times slow. Their decision-making degrades. Their bodies accumulate a debt of stress and disrupted sleep that cannot be repaid in a single night's rest. On the evening of February 16, 1944, with Task Force 58 already closing toward Truk from the northeast, Kobayashi made his decision. He stood down the alert. He sent his pilots to shore leave. They had been on high alert long enough. They needed rest. It was a reasonable human judgment made by a man responsible for the welfare of thousands of aviators who had been burning themselves out, waiting for an enemy that had not appeared. The enemy appeared 12 hours later. The radar systems at Truk were a specific vulnerability that Kobayashi may not have fully understood. Japanese early warning radar in 1944 could not reliably detect aircraft flying below a certain altitude. Mitchell knew this. American carrier doctrine for opening strikes against defended bases had been refined specifically to exploit this gap. Fighter sweep, first flying in at low altitude below the radar ceiling, clearing the defending aircraft from the sky before they could organize. 72 Hellcats lifted off from Task Force 58 in the darkness before dawn on February 17th and flew toward Truk at low altitude. The radar showed nothing. No alarm went out. No scramble order reached the airfields where the pilots were sleeping off weeks of exhaustion. The Hellcats arrived at dawn with complete surprise against a base that had been built on the assumption that surprise was impossible. What they found was not a defended airfield. It was an airfield in the middle of its morning routine. Aircraft parked on the ramps in the positions they had occupied the previous evening. Ground crews moving through their maintenance schedules. Pilots who had been on shore leave, some of them not yet back to base. Others still in their barracks. Others running for their aircraft when the sound of the American engines finally reached them. The Japanese pilots who were airborne when the Hellcats arrived were the ones who had been flying the overnight patrol rotation. There were not many of them. The Hellcats shot them down in minutes and descended on the airfields and began working systematically through the parked aircraft. 30 aircraft destroyed in the first minutes. 50. 70. The pilots running across the tarmac toward their planes were trying to cover several hundred meters of open ground, while American fighters held the altitude advantage, the positional advantage, and 2 years of combat-refined training. Most of them did not reach their aircraft in time. Most of the ones who did could not get airborne before the Hellcats were on them. Within the first hour, Japanese air strength at Truk had been reduced from something capable of organized defense to something capable only of isolated individual resistance. The bombers that followed the fighter sweep arrived over a lagoon where the anti-aircraft guns were still firing, and the fires from the airfields were still spreading, and the warships at anchor were beginning to understand what it meant to be trapped inside a harbor with no exit when the sky belonged to the enemy. The reef that had protected them from naval gunfire was now the wall that prevented their escape. The ships could maneuver within the lagoon. They could not leave it under air attack without passing through the narrow entrance channels that the American aircraft controlled. The torpedo bombers came in at low altitude from multiple directions simultaneously. The dive bombers came down from above. The light cruiser Katori was hit repeatedly and sank. The Naka attempted escape through the southern entrance and was intercepted by the surface ships Mitchell had positioned outside the reef specifically for this purpose. The tankers, the 5 fleet oilers, that represented Japan's ability to fuel naval operations across the entire Central Pacific, were found at their moorings and attacked one after another through the afternoon. By sunset on February 17th, All 5 were gone. The fuel they had been carrying burned on the surface of the lagoon through the night and into the following morning. 17,000 tons of refined petroleum. A fire visible from 50 miles. A light that served as a beacon for the second day's strike, and as a measure precise and unambiguous of what the Japanese Empire had just lost and could not replace. The fortress had not been breached. The walls of the reef were still standing. The garrison of 7,500 soldiers was still inside, still armed, still capable of defending Truk against an invasion. The war had simply decided not to invade. It had decided to leave Truk behind and keep moving west, and the soldiers left inside the reef would not learn the war was over until an American ship arrived in September 1945 to tell them. But that is the ending. Before the ending, there is the question of how Task Force 58 turned 5 airfields and 50 ships and the most formidable naval fortress in the Pacific into ash and wreckage in 48 hours, and what it took to build the force that could do it, and what the men who flew those missions saw when they came down over the lagoon at dawn on February 17th and found the gates of the fortress standing open. In 48 hours, Task Force 58 had turned the most fortified Japanese base in the Pacific into a burning graveyard. 72 Hellcats had swept the sky clean before the defenders could reach their planes. 5 fleet tankers were on the bottom of the lagoon. 50 ships gone. 250 aircraft destroyed. And Mitcher's carriers were already moving toward the next target before the fires at Truk stopped burning. But destroying Truk was only half the problem. The other half was this 7,500 Japanese soldiers were still inside the reef. Still armed. Still dug into fortified mountain positions that had been built specifically to repel an American invasion. And Admiral Chester Nimitz in Pearl Harbor was about to make a decision that his own staff considered strategically reckless, politically impossible, and potentially career-ending. The decision to never attack Truk at all. Not with soldiers, not with ships, not with a ground campaign. Just leave them there and keep moving west. When Nimitz first proposed bypassing Truk entirely, instead of following up Hailstone with an amphibious assault, the response from his senior planning staff was not enthusiasm. It was the institutional resistance of men who had spent 2 years thinking about how to take Truk, not how to ignore it. Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman. Nimitz's war plans officer laid out the objection in plain language during a planning conference in late February 1944. 7,500 entrenched troops with functioning artillery do not become irrelevant because we burned their fuel, Sherman said. The moment we push west of Truk without reducing it, we have an operational base behind our supply lines staffed by soldiers who will be resupplied and reinforced the moment we commit our carriers elsewhere. Nimitz listened. Then he asked one question. How many men do you estimate a direct assault on Truk's fortified positions would cost? Sherman's answer was 15,000 casualties. Minimum. Against prepared defenders in mountainous terrain with prepared tunnels and functioning coastal artillery, assuming moderate Japanese resistance. Against maximum Japanese resistance, the number was not estimable with confidence. Nimitz looked at the map for a long moment. Then we do not assault it, he said. We make it irrelevant. The room was not convinced. Making a garrisoned fortress irrelevant was a theoretical concept. It had never been done at scale in the Pacific War. Every island campaign from Guadalcanal to Tarawa had been fought the same way. Land troops dig the defenders out position by position, count the dead on both sides, move to the next island. The institutional weight of 2 years of that doctrine was not going to dissolve because one admiral said the words, "make it irrelevant," in a planning conference. The man who made the argument work was not Nimitz. It was Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, the amphibious force commander who had more experience landing troops on defended Pacific beaches than any officer alive. Turner had been at Guadalcanal. He had been at Tarawa, where the intelligence failures and the fortification they had not fully mapped had cost 3,000 American lives in 76 hours. Turner knew what fortified island assaults cost. He knew it in a way that could not be expressed in planning documents. Tarawa was a coral shelf 4 miles long, Turner told the planning staff. Truk is mountains and tunnels, and 7,500 men who have been building defensive positions for 5 years. Tarawa cost us 1,000 dead in 76 hours. Truk will cost us that before lunch on the first day. That number landed in the room with the specific weight of a number that everyone present knew was accurate. Tarawa's casualty rate had shaken the American public and generated congressional inquiries. Another Tarawa multiplied by the scale of Truk's defenses was a political event as much as a military one. Turner continued, "We do not need Truk. We need the Marianas. Truk without resupply becomes a prison with walls built by geography. The garrison will consume its stockpiles. The aircraft we destroyed cannot be replaced. The tankers are gone. In 6 months, 7,500 men at Truk are 7,500 men growing vegetables to avoid starvation." The argument was accepted. Not immediately, not unanimously, but the weight of Turner's operational experience combined with Nimitz's strategic instinct produced a plan that would have seemed incomprehensible 12 months earlier. The most powerful naval base in the Japanese Central Pacific would simply be left behind. The test of whether that decision was correct came in the weeks following Hailstone as Mitcher's Task Force 58 continued west toward the Marianas, and the Japanese garrison at Truk began to understand what isolation actually meant. The supply convoys stopped. Not because the Japanese stopped trying to run them. They tried. 3 separate convoy attempts in March and April 1944 were intercepted by American submarines and surface forces before they reached the reef. The submarines that had been hunting Japanese shipping since 1942 were operating now with the full intelligence picture of Japanese convoy routing that the codebreakers at Station HIPO had been developing for 2 years. Every convoy that departed Japan for Truk was sailing into an ambush it could not detect and could not outrun. The replacement aircraft never arrived. The 5 airfields that had held 300 aircraft on the morning of February 17th sat empty. Their runways cratered, their revetments burned. No new aircraft ferried in, because every aircraft ferry route from the home islands to the Central Pacific now passed through airspace that American carriers controlled. The food that had been stockpiled before the raid lasted 3 months at full consumption. After 3 months, the garrison reduced rations. After 6 months, they reduced them again. The tropical diseases that afflicted every Pacific garrison, malaria and dysentery, and the infections that inadequate nutrition made worse and worse over time, began working through the population of soldiers who had no medical resupply, no replacement medications, no evacuation route for the seriously ill. By August 1944, 6 months after Hailstone, the garrison's primary military activity was farming. The men who had been trained and equipped and stationed at the most important Japanese naval base in the Pacific were digging vegetable plots on the hillsides to produce enough calories to keep themselves functional. The artillery was still there. The tunnels were still there. The fortifications were still intact. The army that was supposed to defend them was slowly starving. The strategic consequence of Nimitz's decision became visible not at Truk, but 400 miles to the northwest in the Marianas, where American forces landed at Saipan in June 1944, and found an island chain that could not be reinforced from a Truk that no longer functioned as a base. The garrison at Saipan fought with the same ferocity that had made every Pacific Island campaign costly. But they fought without the logistical support that Truk had provided for every previous Japanese defensive effort in the Central Pacific. The resupply convoys that should have reached Saipan before the American landing could not depart from a base that had no ships and no fuel. Saipan fell. The airfields on Saipan and Tinian that the Americans built after the conquest were 1,100 miles from Tokyo. Close enough for the B-29 Superfortress, the longest-range bomber in the American inventory, to reach the Japanese home islands and return. The bombing campaign that eventually produced the decision to use atomic weapons became possible because the Marianas were taken. The Marianas were taken because Truk was neutralized. Truk was neutralized in 48 hours by a carrier task force that did not exist 2 years earlier. The chain of consequence was that direct and that compressed. Vice Admiral Kobayashi was relieved of command of the 4th Fleet 2 days after Hailstone ended. The staff of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff blamed him for the insufficient alert posture for the failure to disperse his air strength before the raid for the overall state of unreadiness that had allowed a 2-day strike to eliminate 5 years of construction. He was removed from active service entirely by May. His career ended in the specific bureaucratic language of an institution accounting for catastrophe by identifying the individual most proximate to the failure. His replacement was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. The name requires a moment to absorb. Chuichi Nagumo had commanded the Japanese carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The 6th carrier armada that had launched the attack that brought the United States into the war. He had commanded at Midway in June 1942, where 3 of those same carriers had been destroyed in a single morning. He had watched Japan's carrier power diminish battle by battle until the force that had seemed invincible at Pearl Harbor had been reduced to empty flight decks and casualty lists. Now, the Imperial Japanese Navy was sending him to command the ruins of Truk. The appointment was not cruel by intention. It was the Japanese High Command's way of assigning a senior officer of appropriate rank to a post of diminishing strategic significance. But the symmetry it created was specific and uncomfortable. The man who had commanded Japan's greatest offensive strike was being given command of the base that American offensive power had just made irrelevant. He arrived in March 1944 and found a garrison beginning its long descent into isolation. He would leave for Saipan in June, when the American landings there made his position at Truk untenable. He died on Saipan in July 1944, not in combat, but by his own hand, when the American advance made surrender the only remaining option, and his code made surrender impossible. The man who launched Pearl Harbor died on an island that would become the runway from which the atomic bombs were loaded. That is not metaphor. That is the specific geography of consequence. And the consequences were not finished. Because 8 months after Hailstone, the 5 tankers on the floor of Truk Lagoon would reach through time and wreck the last major Japanese naval offensive of the war, at the exact moment Japan needed its fleet to function perfectly. Truk was gone. 50 ships on the bottom of the lagoon. 250 aircraft destroyed on the ground. 5 fleet tankers burning. And Nimitz had made the decision that changed everything. Bypass the fortress, leave the garrison to starve, push west toward the Marianas. Task Force 58 was already moving. The corridor to Japan was open, but the Japanese were not finished. 8 months after Hailstone, the Imperial Japanese Navy would attempt the largest naval operation since Midway. Every surviving battleship, every remaining carrier, every cruiser and destroyer that could still move under its own power. The operation was called Shogo Victory Operation, and it was Japan's final attempt to destroy the American fleet in a single decisive engagement before the war became unwinnable. It failed, and the 5 tankers on the floor of Truk Lagoon were a direct reason why. The intelligence reports that reached Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo in the weeks following Hailstone described the damage in clinical terms that understated the operational reality. Ships sunk, aircraft destroyed, fuel stores lost. What the reports could not fully capture was what the loss of Truk meant to the planning process for every subsequent Japanese naval operation. Before Hailstone, Japanese fleet planners had a central base in the Central Pacific from which any operation could be fueled, staged, and coordinated. After Hailstone, they had nothing between Japan and Singapore. Vice Admiral Suemu Toyota, who assumed command of the combined fleet in May 1944 after his predecessor died when his transport aircraft was shot down, understood the problem immediately. He described it in his post-war interrogation with the precision of a man who had spent months working around a constraint that had no solution. Every operation we planned after February 1944 was planned around the fuel question, Toyota told American interrogators in 1945. Not the question of whether we had enough aircraft or enough ships. The question of whether we had enough fuel to move the ships we had to the place we needed them. The fuel question had a specific answer, and the answer was Truk. The tanker capacity that had been destroyed in the lagoon on February 17th represented roughly 20% of Japan's operational fleet fueling capability in the Central Pacific at that moment. 20% sounds recoverable. In a logistics system that was already operating at the margins of adequacy, 20% was catastrophic. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. In June 1944 demonstrated this. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sortied with 9 carriers and 473 aircraft to meet Mitscher's Task Force 58 near the Marianas. In 2 days of combat on June 19th and 20th, Japanese carrier aviation was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. American pilots and fighter direction teams shot down 376 Japanese aircraft while losing 29 of their own. The pilots who survived the slaughter called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a name that captured the one-sidedness of the engagement with the specific casualness of men who had been good enough at their jobs to make killing feel easy. Ozawa's pilots had been trained for an average of 250 hours. Mitscher's pilots had been trained for 3 times that in programs that had been running continuously since Pearl Harbor, rotating combat veterans back to training commands so that the men going into battle carried the accumulated knowledge of every engagement since Coral Sea. Ozawa knew his pilots were undertrained. He knew it before the battle. He flew them anyway because the strategic situation in June 1944 did not offer the option of waiting until they were ready. The Marianas were being invaded. Either the combined fleet stopped it now, or the B-29s would be flying from Saipan before the year ended. The training deficit was a fuel consequence. Pilots need flight hours to become effective. Flight hours require aviation fuel. Aviation fuel in June 1944 was constrained by the tanker losses that had been accumulating since American submarines began their campaign in 1942, and that had accelerated dramatically on February 17, 1944, in a lagoon called Truk. The Turkey Shoot ended Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. 376 aircraft and their pilots gone in 2 days. 3 carriers sunk. The flight decks that survived were flight decks with no trained pilots to fly from them. 4 months later at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, those empty flight decks became the central element of the most elaborate and desperate naval stratagem of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese plan for Leyte Gulf was called Shogo 1, and it was built around a problem that had no clean solution. Japan had battleships and cruisers. Japan had carriers with flight decks but almost no aircraft and almost no trained pilots. Japan did not have a single base between the home islands and the Philippines where the fleet could concentrate and fuel for a unified operation. Truk had been that base. Truk was gone. Toyota split his forces into 3 separate groups, sortying from separate ports. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would bring the main surface force 5 battleships, including the Yamato and Musashi 12 cruisers and 15 destroyers, north from Linga Roads near Singapore. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring a smaller surface force from the same direction through the Surigao Strait. The carriers, stripped of aircraft and useful only as decoys, would sortie from Japan under Vice Admiral Ozawa and attempt to draw Halsey's 3rd Fleet north and away from the landing beaches. The plan required 3 separate forces to coordinate their movements across thousands of miles of ocean without a central base, with limited communication security, and against an American fleet that controlled the air over every approach route. The tactical complexity this imposed was a direct consequence of having no Truk. A unified fleet operation from a central base in the Central Pacific was no longer possible because the base had been on the bottom of a lagoon since February. Kurita's force was intercepted in the Sibuyan Sea on October 24th. American carrier aircraft attacked in 5 waves over 6 hours. The Musashi, the largest battleship Japan had ever built, 65,000 tons of steel and armor, took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits and rolled over and sank in the afternoon. Kurita reversed course. His staff believed the operation was over. Then, for reasons that historians have debated for 80 years, he reversed again and pressed on through the San Bernardino Strait into the night. On the morning of October 25th, Kurita's force emerged from the strait and found itself facing what appeared to be the main American fleet. It was not. It was Taffy 3, a force of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts that had been providing air support for the Leyte landings and had no business being in the path of 5 battleships and 10 cruisers. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary engagements in naval history. The destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 turned toward Kurita's battleships and attacked. Not because they had a reasonable chance, because there was nothing else to do. The USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, made smoke and launched torpedoes at cruisers and drove between the escort carriers and the Japanese battleships and absorbed gunfire that should have sunk her in the first minutes and kept fighting for 2.5 hours before she went down. Evans was Cherokee. He was from Oklahoma. He had told his crew before the battle that he was not expecting to survive the war, and that his intention was to make his death cost the enemy as much as possible. At Leyte Gulf, he made it cost considerably more than that. Kurita facing what appeared to be aggressive American destroyers and what he mistakenly believed was fleet carrier aviation. Overhead lost his nerve. He had already lost the Musashi. His force had been under air attack for most of 2 days. His communications with Tokyo were fragmentary. He turned north and then northwest and eventually withdrew without destroying Taffy 3 and without reaching the Leyte landing beaches. The Japanese lost 3 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers at Leyte Gulf. The American losses were 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. It was the last time the Imperial Japanese Navy would sortie in force. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese surface fleet ceased to exist as an operational instrument. It had no fuel. It had no trained pilots. It had no base from which to stage and coordinate. The 5 tankers on the floor of Truk Lagoon had been carrying 17,000 tons of fuel oil when they went down in February. 17,000 tons is not a decisive number in isolation. In the context of a fuel logistics system already operating at the edge of adequacy, with American submarines destroying replacement tankers faster than Japanese shipyards could build them, 17,000 tons was the difference between operations that were barely possible and operations that were impossible. Toyota said it plainly in his interrogation. The fuel situation was the primary limiting factor in every plan after February 1944. The tankers that had been at Truk were tankers that were not available when Japan needed them most. The fuel they would have carried was fuel that Japanese warships did not have when the Turkey shoot began, when Kurita sortied toward Leyte, when the last coherent Japanese naval strategy was attempted and failed. Nimitz's assessment after the war identified Hailstone as the single action that most directly enabled the subsequent American advance. Without Truk neutralized, the Marianas invasion would have required a preliminary campaign. With Truk gone, the corridor was open. The schedule that produced Saipan, the Turkey shoot, the Marianas bases, the B-29 campaign, the atomic decision was made possible by 48 hours in February. The fortress fell in 2 days. The consequences took 18 months to finish playing out. And there is one more consequence that no operational report captures. One that exists not in staff papers or fleet histories, but in the water itself, at depths between 15 and 65 meters inside the reef that was supposed to make Truk impregnable. The ships that the Hellcats and torpedo bombers sent to the bottom in February 1944 are still there. They have been there for 80 years, and what happened to them after the guns stopped matters as much as what happened to them when the guns were firing. The ships went down in February 1944. The fires burned for 2 days. The garrison starved for 16 months. The tankers pulled Kurita's battleships toward Leyte Gulf with insufficient fuel and no room for error. And the war ended in August 1945 with atomic bombs dropped from runways built on islands that Truk's destruction had made accessible. That is the strategic arc, clean, causal, documented in staff papers and fleet histories and post-war interrogation transcripts that fill hundreds of archive boxes in Washington and Tokyo. But there is one more part of this story. The part that happens underwater. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo died on Saipan on July 6, 1944. The American advance had compressed the Japanese defensive perimeter to a final ridgeline on the northern end of the island. The soldiers who remained were out of ammunition, out of food, and out of options. Nagumo, who had commanded at Pearl Harbor and watched Japan's carrier power dissolve battle by battle until there was nothing left to command, chose death over surrender in accordance with a code that made surrender unthinkable. He was 60 years old. He had spent his career in a navy that had built its identity around offensive power, and he had watched that power destroyed engagement by engagement from a command position that gave him perfect visibility into every loss and no ability to reverse any of them. He had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor with 6 carriers and 350 aircraft, and believed for approximately 6 months that Japan had struck a blow from which America could not recover in time to matter. Then Midway happened. Then the Solomons. Then Truk. Then Saipan. The arc of Nagumo's career is the arc of the Pacific War compressed into one man's biography. He was present at the moment of Japan's greatest offensive confidence, and present at the moment the last coherent Japanese defense collapsed. The man who launched Pearl Harbor died on the island from which the atomic bombs would be loaded 19 months before the bombs were ready. No historian has fully accounted for what that symmetry costs to contemplate. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, the man whose decision to stand down the alert on the evening of February 16th had made Hailstone possible, was relieved of command 2 days after the raid ended and removed from active service by May. He survived the war. He died in 1954, a decade after the lagoon he had failed to defend stopped burning. History has not treated him harshly in the way that history treats commanders whose failures are more visible. His name appears in footnotes. His decision appears in operational analyses as a case study in alert fatigue and the specific danger of sustained high readiness postures that produce no contact. He is the man whose exhausted pilots made the most consequential naval air raid of the Pacific War possible, and most people who know the story of Truk do not know his name. Mark Mitcher, who commanded Task Force 58 and designed the execution of Hailstone with the specific sequencing that made it work, went on to command American carrier forces at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. He was promoted to full admiral after the war and died in 1947 of a heart attack, 2 years after the conflict, whose carrier warfare he had done more than any other single officer to define. He was 60 years old, the same age as Nagumo when Nagumo died on Saipan. Two admirals opposite sides, same age, same war, the same 48 hours in February that separated their trajectories permanently. Chester Nimitz lived until 1966. He was present at the Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri in September 1945 and signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States. His one-sentence summary of Hailstone that the Pacific Fleet had returned at Truk, the visit made by the Japanese fleet at Pearl Harbor, remained his preferred formulation for what had happened in the lagoon. He believed until his death that Hailstone was the single most consequential naval air operation of the Pacific War, more consequential than Midway in its strategic effects, because Midway stopped Japanese expansion, while Hailstone opened the American advance. The 7,500 soldiers of the Truk garrison surrendered in September 1945 when an American ship arrived and informed them the war was over. They had been on the island for 16 months after Hailstone, with no communication with the outside world, except occasional air attacks that reminded them the war was continuing somewhere they could not see. They had eaten through their stockpiles, contracted tropical diseases at rates that their medical supplies could not address, and converted the slopes of the central island into agricultural plots that produced barely enough calories to maintain functional military discipline. They surrendered in good order. They were not broken men. They were men who had done what they were ordered to do, which was hold Truk, and had held it successfully against an invasion that never came, because the war had decided they were not worth invading. The specific cruelty of their situation, trained and equipped and stationed at the most important base in the Pacific, then left behind when the war moved on, is one of the Pacific War's less examined chapters. They did not fail. They were simply made irrelevant by a strategic decision that had nothing to do with their capability or their courage. The wrecks they left behind the ships that the Hellcats and torpedo bombers sent to the bottom on February 17th and 18th are still there. Jacques Cousteau brought Truk Lagoon to international attention in a 1969 documentary that showed the world what a naval battle looks like when it has been underwater for 25 years. The footage was extraordinary and strange. Ships that had been weapons of war had become artificial reefs, their hulls colonized by coral and soft corals and sponges, their holds still containing the cargo they had been carrying when they went down. Cousteau's cameras found 0 fighters in the hold of the Fujikawa Maru, packed in their continuous industrial and human effort directed toward a capability that did not exist on the morning of Pearl Harbor. The attack on Pearl Harbor created the political will to build that capability. The shipyards and training programs and engineering teams did the building. Mitcher and his admirals developed the doctrine for using it. By February 1944, the capability was ready. Kobayashi's decision to stand down the alert created the opportunity. His pilots needed rest. That was true. The decision was reasonable. And it opened a 90-minute window on the morning of February 17th, during which 72 Hellcat fighters could arrive over Truk's airfields with complete surprise against a base that had been built on the assumption that surprise was impossible. Preparation meeting. Opportunity is how most decisive military actions work when you examine them at sufficient resolution. The side with the better prepared force meeting the right opportunity at the right moment tends to win. What Hailstone demonstrates is how large the consequences of that intersection can be when the strategic position is exactly right. 48 hours of carrier aviation did not win the Pacific War, but it opened the corridor through which the Marianas were taken, from which the B-29 campaign was launched, at the end of which stood the decision that ended the war. The final detail that most accounts of Hailstone omit is this: the reef is still there. The coral barrier that made Truk seem impregnable, that naval gunfire from outside could never penetrate, that generations of Japanese planners had relied upon as the foundation of the base's defensive theory, is still 30 miles across. It still encloses the lagoon. It still makes the water inside calm and clear and protected from the open Pacific swells. It protected nothing that mattered. The aircraft that destroyed Truk flew over it. The ships that Truk was supposed to shelter are on the bottom beneath it. The garrison that the reef was supposed to protect starved inside it for 16 months, while the war finished without them. The geography did not change. The technology changed around the geography until the geography became shipping crates, never assembled, sent to reinforce an air force that was destroyed before they could be unpacked. He found tanks on the Nippo Maru artillery pieces, cases of gas masks, the material inventory of a war that had ended before most of it could be used. The documentary produced a phenomenon that has continued for more than 50 years. Divers began making pilgrimages to Truk Lagoon, drawn by the combination of exceptional diving conditions, the biodiversity of the reef systems that had colonized the wrecks, and the specific quality of being inside a place where a battle happened, and where the physical evidence of that battle had been preserved rather than removed or destroyed. The wrecks are war graves under Micronesian law. The islands were renamed Truk in 1990, part of the Federated States of Micronesia, and the lagoon is now Truk Lagoon in formal usage. Though the name Truk persists in historical literature and in the consciousness of the diving community worldwide. No salvage is permitted. The personal belongings found in the cabins of ships, boots and mess kits, and photographs that survived decades of immersion are left where they are. The Yamagiri Maru still holds its 16-inch naval shells in its forward hold, still live after 80 years underwater, still dangerous enough that diving authorities warn against disturbing them. On the anniversary of the raid, each February divers gather at the lagoon and descend to the wrecks to mark what happened in 48 hours in 1944. They are the annual witnesses to a battle that most history books cover in a paragraph conducted over a graveyard that most people will never see, in water that accepts the presence of visitors without offering any explanation of what it contains. The lesson that Hailstone teaches is not primarily a lesson about carrier aviation, or logistics, or the specific mechanics of how Task Force 58 executed a fighter sweep. Those details matter to military historians, and they are worth understanding, but they are not the reason this story has the weight it has. The lesson is about the relationship between preparation and opportunity, and about what happens when those two things meet at a specific moment in a specific place. The American carrier force that attacked Truk in February 1944 had been building since December 1941. Every ship, every aircraft, every pilot, every doctrine refinement, every radar system and combat information center and fighter direction technique represented 2 years of irrelevant. That is what happened at Truk in February 1944. That is what the wrecks on the floor of the lagoon commemorate every February when the divers descend to mark the anniversary. 50 ships, 250 aircraft, 4,500 men, 5 tankers whose loss echoed through every Japanese naval operation for the remaining 18 months of the war. A fortress that fell in 48 hours, and whose falling made possible the chain of events that ended the largest and most destructive conflict in human history. The water is still deep, the reef is still standing, the ships are still inside it. That is the weight of 48 hours. That is what it costs to erase a fortress. And that is why 80 years later, divers still descend through the clear water of Truk Lagoon, in February passing through the schools of fish that have made their homes in the holds of ships that were weapons once, to sit for a moment in the silence at the bottom of a battle that most people have never heard of, and to understand that the largest events in history are made of the smallest decisions, and that the most consequential 48 hours of the Pacific War began with a Japanese admiral deciding to let his pilots sleep.